My name is Maria Sanchez, and I'm going to be your presenter today. A little bit of background info on me is that I recently graduated at Indiana University of Pennsylvania with a bachelor's in art history. I particularly like ancient to medieval art, but I do enjoy contemporary as well. And a few things I wanted to make note of before we start is that this is not a complete set of information on Byzantine art. It is more of a quick run through of the most obvious parts of it. So with that being said, let's jump right in. So I wanted to start with some 5 W's about this. So the 5 W's: who, what, when, where, and why, and the historical background. So what, obviously being the Byzantine Empire, Byzantine art and architecture in particular. And Byzantine art is typically divided into 3 categories: early, middle, and late. And early Byzantine was from around 330 to 730. And the middle Byzantine was 843 to 1204, and late being 1261 to 1453. And for this presentation, we'll be focusing on dates as early as 200 to around the Middle Byzantine, and where it took place mostly in Byzantium and Constantinople. Roman Emperor Constantine I relocated the central powers of the Roman Empire from the western half to the eastern half in Byzantium, creating a new capital of the city and renaming it Constantinople after himself. In around 330 AD, and Constantinople today is what is Istanbul, Turkey. And we'll see that come up quite a bit as we go on. So for who, we have so many figures going on, but some key figures include emperors like Constantine, Justinian, Theodosius the Great, Theodoric, Maxentius, among others. And some key religious figures include the Virgin Mary, Christ as child, countless saints like Peter and Paul. Most of the saints cathedrals were dedicated to, which would be their patron saints. And there's also some mythological figures in there as well, such as Apollo and Tyche, Helios. They made appearances, but they were often transposed to the likeness of emperors. Which is a common occurrence, not just in Byzantine art, but all throughout art history. And for the why, it's politics, religion, and art, but that is a very, very basic answer to that, but we'll understand it more in depth as we go on. But for everyone here right now and online with us, knowing just these few things about Byzantine Empire, I would like to know what everyone thinks the art would look like. So you can just think of it in your head or, call out, but.
Old.
Cold?
Old.
Old. Yes, it does look very old. A lot of it looks very old. But we'll move on from there. And so this is where 200s comes into play. So this is right before early Byzantine. And so in around 150 to 200 AD, we find a catacomb carving in Domitilla, Rome. And right here, this is somewhat of a precursor to Christianity. At this point in time, Christianity wasn't so much of a religion as it was a cult. And so people who were under the belief of Christianity were kind of hiding underground.
I just tried to get into it.
Sorry about that.
Oh, that's all right. Sounds like you're here. So right here we have a picture of a anchor with 2 fish, and you'll notice all throughout Christianity you see symbols of fish. Which this could have been one of the earliest, if not the earliest, depictions of fish within the Bible or within Christian religion. And here is another one in the middle here. It's an anchor, a fish, and a key row. And a key row is basically a letter P with an X throughout it, and that is the symbol of Christ. And we'll get later into that in a bit, but you can find this at St. Sebastian's in Rome as well. And over towards the right, we have what was also found on a catacomb, which is a Greek acrostic for the word fish, which is ichthys. And each letter, each symbol translates to mean Jesus Christ, God, Son, Savior. And so fish is Jesus. And this acrostic would have been placed on tombs and catacombs to kind of let fellow believers know that they believed without being too obvious. So this was kind of the setting up of the Byzantine. And so over here, I do have kind of a map of Constantinople during the Byzantine era. So this was how far and how vast it reached. This is how big the empire was. And it did fluctuate a lot through time, as you can see through here. So the red line all throughout was the extent of the sea, which there was a lot of trading involved that you could see through the water. And then it diminished in about 1020, and the empire just ended up being Asia Minor and Bulgaria and some little pieces around there. And by 1360, it had all but, diminished to a small portion. So you could see how it fluctuated a lot. But at its height, it was very large. So I'd like to bring up some important dates to remember. These are probably some of the most important dates, and there were a lot of little things that went on throughout. But in 1312, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge occurred, and that was where Constantine had a dream before battle in which God appeared before him and gave him the sign of the chora that we saw previously, and told him that he would conquer with the sign. So he had all of his soldiers put the chora and embellish it on their shields, on their swords, on their armor, and of course they did win. And so that prompted Constantine to create a Christian empire. And so in 1313, the Edict of Milan and the Toleration Act occurred, which legalized Christianity and became the official state religion, which was a big turning point, because previous to this, most people were of Muslim or Jewish belief. And so in 324, Constantine moves the Roman capital to Byzantium. So, and the reason for doing that was also because it was a huge trade port. And so a lot of income was coming in through that way. So it just made sense to put it there. And there was actually a tetrarchy where there were 4 emperors or popes ruling at one time. And so things kind of just got misplaced. But in 325, the Council of Nicaea occurred, and the relationship between emperors and God was defined. And so Roman emperors were considered divine, much like saints. And so it is important to understand that emperors really tried to transpose their likeness into that of religious figures and God himself, or even prior to this, they would be likened to other emperors or Greek and Roman gods. Moving on from here, this is the first cathedral we're going to be looking at, and it is Hagia Sophia. So the mosaic right here is depicting the Virgin, which is also called a Theotokos, and the child flanked by Constantine and Justinian. So flank just means one person or thing is on either side of what is being flanked. And it was around the 10th century AD, and both Constantine and Justinian are seen holding Hagia Sophia. They look different because Hagia Sophia was being worked over time, and each emperor that contributed would add, take things away. It would get destroyed through earthquakes. There was just a lot of building, crumbling, and rebuilding being done. And the inscriptions to the sides of Justinian and Constantine read, Justinian, the emperor of illustrious memory, and Saint Constantine numbered among the stars. So it's important to also recognize that pieces like these were very much political, just as much as they were religious. And so emperors would not only try to get the favor of the public by commissioning all these works in church, they would also be seen as saintly and godly, and it would very much strengthen their tie to the empire. All right, so I'd like to point out, like, what kind of details do we notice and what makes them so important? So if we go back, we can see that both Justinian and Constantine have halos, just like the Virgin and Christ. And halos, it is cool to see both Virgin and Child with halos, but why Constantine and Justinian? Both Constantine and Justinian patron the church, along with other religious and monetary contributions. Also why they're depicting holding Hagia Sophia. It's like they're offering to God. Because of this, they were awarded a holy status not unlike that of a saint. Creating this mosaic of themselves also served as a form of propaganda in which they would be favored by the public and strengthen their legitimacy over the empire. And not just throughout the Byzantine Empire, but all throughout art history, key figures, emperors, kings, and so on, the wealthy elite would commission work for themselves or for the public to be seen favorably. So this was not out of the ordinary. And other important details, which you might not get from the actual picture itself, but location. Being located over the door of the southwest vestibule, which is where that mosaic was, makes sense because emperors often entered into the inner narthex through the southwest vestibule. Location in art and architecture was supremely important, both in a literal and a metaphoric sense. Almost every mosaic in a cathedral within the Byzantine era was strategically placed to express ideas like sainthood, proximity to the heavens, or often a subconscious line of sight to lead viewers in the right direction. And I'd like to point out an example of this. This is a little hard. I tried getting a different picture, but this was the closest thing I could come up with. And so this is Santa Maria Antiqua in Rome around the 7th century. You can see it's pretty crumbly, but it is preserved as well as we could have preserved it. But in a cathedral like this, it was known that towards the bottom, you can still see paintings and frescoes and mosaics, in which case you would have to physically bend over and look towards the ground, in which case that would be a humble position. And when you're kneeling towards the ground, that would also be considered proskynesis, which would basically be like just humbling yourself before God in prayer and reverence. So everything is placed just such, but it's placed in such a way that it exemplifies its location as well. So other details, I found this out while researching this, which is very interesting to me. So this is a close-up of Justinian holding Hagia Sophia. And here we can see that during the Byzantine times, the outer colors were that of light and dark blue, which represented the heavens, with the windows framed in white. And today, the dome and roof is covered in gray lead sheets. It is possible that some of the original lead sheets survive, but it's more likely that the original sheets were simply melted and reused, which also happened a lot during the Byzantine era because there were a lot of natural disasters, a lot of crusades, so things were continuously demolished and built back up again. So here I just like this picture a lot, which was the first mosaic we saw at the beginning in Hagia Sophia. And this is just an artist's recreation of what it would look like when they were creating this. And you could see all the geometric pattern work up at top, which were called, well, I forget at the moment. But off to the right-hand side, you can see that there are images of the Virgin and Christ and other people, and it was extremely common to not come up with your own version or your own image of saints, of holy people, of anyone, because these images were reused and reused and reused, and they had a sense of uniformity to them all, so you could be able to recognize them. And because they were holy and icons, you didn't want to stray from what was already established. But it's just very interesting to see what it would have been like when people were creating this, or any other mosaic in a cathedral for that matter. And here is also in Hagia Sophia, and it's the mosaic of Virgin and Child, and it's located in an apse, so it's this curved, vaulted ceiling, and it's one of the oldest mosaics in the church. Like this mosaics and many other images and frescoes, it was reworked up to several times due to iconoclasm. Once destroyed, many of these spaces were filled with crosses or left blank. And I think there's an image online you could probably find where it's like an X-ray, and you could see where an old cross laid. So there's been a lot of reworking of the images and not just the actual architecture as well. And the next church we are going to look at is the Church of Chora, and the other word is the Turkish translation of the Church of Chora, and this is also a cathedral. But what I find interesting is that it has an extensive history of being utilized for many different purposes. It was once a monastery, a church, a mosque, a museum, a tomb, and it's currently being used as a mosque as of 2020. And it was founded between the 4th and the 6th century, and was rebuilt after its collapse during the 11th century, and rebuilt again in the 12th century. So it was built outside of Constantinople city walls, and it was erected by Constantine, but was later included as part of the city's defenses when Theodosius II built his land walls from 413 to 414. And both walls were greatly affected by earthquakes and other natural disasters. But what's interesting about it being placed outside of city walls is it was extremely frowned upon to bury the dead within the city walls. It was believed to be unclean and unhealthy. So only extremely wealthy and important figures were ever buried within city walls. Like Julius Caesar and people like him were some of the only few people who were ever buried within city walls. So you see a lot of churches and mosques and cathedrals based outside of those city walls. It was later restored and expanded by Theodore. I'm not going to pronounce his name. We're just going to call him Theodore. But that was in 1315 through 1321. And a Paraclesion, which is a funerary chapel, that portion probably houses Theodore's tomb in the West Bay. Church of Chora is a centrally planned structure, and centrally planned structures are known to be tombs in Greek and Roman architecture. So when you see cathedrals and they have a central circular structure, that's where it comes from. It was basically a burial or tomb site. And so we have a little more information on this fellow, and in here he is seen offering the Church of the Chora to Christ. So just like we saw with Hagia Sophia, here's a picture of him who commissioned some of the work here to be offered to Christ himself, and he himself is being positioned in what we call proskynesis. And it's interesting because the church faces frontally, which is odd for later Byzantine. Typically you see them at like a 3/4 angle, or just not the front. It is not presented entirely accurate at the time the mosaic was created. A lunette above the portal is without its patron saints. Crosses flanking either side of the portal, which is the door, are also recorded as never being there. So it's interesting because the other ones in Hagia Sophia were accurate for their time. The golden portal references the golden portal of Constantinople and the golden portal of Jerusalem, where either Mary's parents had met or someone told something great happened with Mary's parents at the portal of Jerusalem as well. So that could be a huge indicator of why there is a golden portal on the Church of Chora. And here we have a plan of its layout. And this is really interesting to me because we can see what's original, what was done later, and what was done last. And so the darkest portions towards the middle were the original church. And later additions, which were the Byzantine additions, were the shaded gray. So you see they built an entirely separate structure. And there was a lot of art in these two structures, like a backwards L. And only a little Turkish work was done. There was some on the dome vault, but you could see those mostly over here. There was later a minaret added, and so there were very small portions that were Turkish inclusions. But the picture that we just saw, or this is the picture we're going to see that is in the plan, this is the Paraklesion, which is the side chapel, located to the right of the esonarthex. And so there are esonarthex, exonarthex, and narthex. So eso and exo meaning inside and out. This was used as a mortuary chapel holding family burials and memorial services. And the chapel is adorned with numerous frescoes. But I want to take a step back for a second and show you where exactly this is in the plan. So towards the left-hand side of the original church inclusions, specifically like over here, and that dome-like shape, that's where that is. And so I think it's just interesting to see where it would be located in the actual church. But moving on from there, this was a fresco at the top where we saw before, at the very top right there. And this is an anastasis, which is also known as a resurrection fresco. Pictured as Christ after the harrowing of hell, lifting Adam and Eve from their graves, which I had never seen before. So this was interesting. I've seen it since, but up until finding this, I had never seen such a representation. But Adam is behind John the Baptist, Solomon, and David. And behind Eve are a following of saved kings and emperors. And note, Christ is covered by a mandorla, which is basically a full-bodied halo, indicative of a transcendence of time and space. So this also makes sense because Christ is coming up from hell and bringing Adam and Eve with him. So he has transcended time and space to become resurrected and live from the dead. And this is a Virgin and Child Paraklesion dome featuring Islamic-inspired floral motif, which is very interesting because you have a lot of melding cultures and artwork all in one location. And don't get me wrong, there was a lot of feuding and a lot of resistance among different religions and different cultures and sets of belief. But there were points of mutual respect where you could see multiple forms of art in one location at a time. And it's also important to note that in Islamic art, you couldn't feature physical beings like animals or people. And so a lot of their work was very pattern oriented and very floral. It was supposed to be indicative of animals and nature and flora and fauna, but not show it. So it's just very interesting. And around the whole circle, around the icon of the Virgin and Christ, you see all this patchwork of squares, and these would be called tesserae, which are basically square tiles. Even the tile work that you see in mosaics would be called tesserae, which sounds like the word tesseract because that's where it comes from. And now we're going to move on to iconoclasm. So iconoclasm had two periods, starting from 730 to 787, and then again from 814 to 843. And this is one of my favorite icons. It's called an icon of Christ, the Pantocrator, and Pantocrator means all ruler. So if you see an image of Christ with a book in his hand and his hand in such a way, you can assume that it is a Pantocrator. Pantocrators are typically shown full-bodied figures, and they also are represented in domes, but they can be seen elsewhere and not full-bodied. But I would like to ask, what stands out to you guys in this icon in particular?
His hands,
Yes, his hands.
which I see in a lot of icons, and
Absolutely.
what is that signifying?
I'm not 100% sure. It might be a blessing. There are a lot of different hand gestures within art like this. I actually need to study that a little more because there are so many and they're different and they signify different things. But my best guess would be that it is like a blessing. And so one thing I'd like to point out, what like interests me and comes out to me in this icon, is that Christ is seen having a dual expression. And in an image like this, it means he is shown with two different emotions being portrayed in one face, in one image. Towards the left-hand side, you see he is very calm. He looks welcoming. He's ready to receive his children into the kingdom. But if you look to the right of his face, he looks kind of concerned. He looks almost judgmental. And one of the things about icons is that they were supposed to present back to you the emotions that you were giving out. And so if you had sinned and you felt like God was judging you, or you were going through tragedy, you would see him with a brow furrowed and, you know, with anguish kind of in his eyes. But if you were a new believer and you know, you were doing good for your community and you were looking for the acceptance of God, you would see the left side of his face where you'd be welcomed into open arms. So it's just very interesting. So what you put in is what comes back. And people at this time also believed that these icons had power. They weren't the actual person they were being represented by, but they did obtain power from the person that they were presenting to be. So icon means image and klasm means to break. And so here's a rundown of all of the iconoclasm history. So in 726, the icon of Christ on a chalk gate, which is an imperial entrance, was destroyed, and those are located on cathedrals. But in 730, Patriarch of Byzantium expelled from office for refusing to sign an iconoclast edict. And from 753 to 754, iconoclast leads to a systematic persecution of icondules, which were those who venerate images, and they destroyed those images. From 760, crosses replaced figured mosaics at St. Irene, Constantinople, much like what I showed you at the beginning of the mosaic of the Virgin and Christ on the apse. And in 787 to 814, there was an interlude, and the icon of Christ was removed from the chalk gate again, and the iconoclasm was declared a heresy. But in 814, iconoclasm was reimposed, and the chalk gate Christ was removed yet again. So there is so much back and forth going on throughout a lot of these architectural feats. But in 843, that was the end of iconoclasm, and restoration of the icon of Christ on the chalk gate was reimposed under Empress Theodora. But here's another example of an icon that is very telling of, you know, icon culture during this time. This is the Mandylion icon of Edessa. And I'm not going to pronounce that word because I'm sure I would just butcher it. But basically that word is what is considered an image that is not created by human hands. It is a miraculous or true portrait of Christ or the Virgin or of some other saint, but more often than not, Christ or the Virgin. The Bishop of Abgar of Edessa asked God to heal him, and God refused, but sent an image on a cloth to him, which healed him. So that's the most basic, quick rundown of that story. But if you are interested in more details of that story, you could look it up online. Look up Bishop Abgar of Edessa, and you'll find a whole slew of stories. I've also refrained from telling a more in-depth story because there are several different versions, but that's the most conclusive version of the story. But this was the first record of an image believed to have originated in 593 and was relocated to Constantinople in the 10th century. The image was lost again, or it was lost in 1204 during the Fourth Crusade. There are people, however, who do believe that it showed up in France at some point, but there's no conclusive evidence. But again, this icon is believed to have been made by holy hands. Like, no human hands have touched this image. A lot of people, you could think of things like the Shroud of Turin. That would be a very similar example. And so a lot of arguments for and against iconoclasm. There was only one real big argument against it, which was the possibility of idolatry, which goes against the Ten Commandments, because you weren't to idolize these icons. You were supposed to use them to get closer to God, not to, pray to themselves. But John of Damascus was a big figure who was in favor of iconoclasm. And he made these arguments, like, one, God made man in his image, so why would it be wrong to portray God's image? And it allowed those who can't read to understand the events of Christ's life, because a majority of people weren't educated on how to read or write at this point. So pictorial evidence went very, very far with the public. And God authorized the Holy Covenant with images of cherubim, which are those cute little naked baby angels you see around. And the miraculous icons, which we just saw, prove that they had divine authorization because they weren't made by human hands. So God wouldn't have ordained it had it not been allowed by God himself. So I don't know about you, but I think he makes some pretty solid arguments. But throughout this time, the Acts of the Seventh Ecumenical Council of Nicaea of 787 occurred. And basically, they came to these conclusions that they would only portray Christ's visible human nature and make no claim to share in his invisible divine nature. So they were only showcasing his humanity, but not his divinity. And this was a church tradition and a practice of church fathers. So this was something that was already established and something that they didn't want to go against because it was within their belief. And here is another figure, which is Theodore the Studite. And he made some interesting remarks and theories and philosophy around iconoclasm. So imitation links those images to the model, which would be Christ or the Virgin, despite differences of substance, which would be their nature. It distinguishes between natural and imitative image, which means natural shares the nature, which shares the divinity, which shares the holiness of a person, but not the nature. Wait, I think I got that mixed up. Anyway, it distinguishes between natural and imitative image. Natural shares nature, but not the person. An example of this would be the Trinity. You can show Christ or God, as the Trinity, but you can't really depict the Trinity. How do you depict something that isn't physical? Is basically what that's trying to explain. And imitative shares the person, but not the nature, which would be a visual representation of Christ, but not his divinity. And they would never lay claim to identify of both nature and person, because that would lead to polytheism and idolatry. So worth noting, influence of iconoclast supporters shares Jewish and Muslim origins. Shortly before iconoclasm, Muslim Caliph Yazid declared the destruction and removal of icons within his territory. So this all happened before iconoclasm in the Byzantine realm. So you can see influence from other areas, from other people, from other cultures. And so this is John of Damascus. And while John of Damascus had a major influence on iconoclasm, he resided within Muslim lands. And here we have an icon of him. And towards the bottom here, I just thought this was cool to add because this is a very religious thing that has been done, is this is a relic of his bones. Whether they're actually his bones or not, I couldn't tell you what kind of bone they are. But a lot of churches and cathedrals lay claim to have actual relics of saints or even Christ himself. And so they would build these reliquaries around them, and people would actually travel on pilgrimages to see these. And it's very interesting because people would feel blessed to see them and heal them, and that they had their own power, much like icons. And here is another icon that I'd like to get into, called the Vladimir Virgin icon. This icon is considered an example of a hodegetria. Excuse me. And a hodegetria means one who shows the way. And you could see this through the Virgin's hand gesture pointing to Christ, that he is the way. And this icon is believed to have been painted by St. Luke the Apostle while the Virgin was alive, providing it efficacy. So this icon would also be considered that A word that I can't pronounce, because it was divinely inspired. Actually, maybe not. It was divinely inspired because he was alive when Mary was around, but it wasn't, godly hands that did it. It was man-made. But I also thought this was interesting to note. So did you know the Virgin of It's important to understand that icons in particular tend to be extremely similar to one another in composition and style, even if their creations were hundreds of years apart. So much like we saw earlier with that artist's depiction of how the apse in Hagia Sophia was made, you had these icons already established, and you would make them again and again and again, and you would not mess with the style, you wouldn't mess with the image itself, you would simply be trying to copy it, which is very interesting, because it's often difficult to tell icons with the same figure apart from one another, even if they were 300 years apart. And often only artists with trained eyes can spot the nuances between them. And it would be considered like really bad to try to put your own spin on it, or a little detail that's your own, like, hey, I did this. So people very much shied away from that. But here is a image of him painting this icon. And now I'd like to get into manuscripts. So manuscripts were another big portion of Byzantine culture and religious activity. And this is called the Kludov Psalter, and it was around 850 to 875, and it is now in Moscow in the Historical Museum. And it was a marginal psalter. Illuminations, which are these little drawings you see, are thought to be created at Studios Monastery in Constantinople, which was the same monastery where Theodore the Studite was a monk. And featured here is Folio 67R, depicting John the Grammarian whitewashing an image of Christ. And having these two images side by side, it compares the destruction and eradication of icons to those who killed Christ. which is very interesting. So it's very much likening people who destroy icons to those who put Christ on the cross. It's a polemical use of images, which is basically a smear campaign against iconoclasts. But I wanted to touch note really quick and say, like, folio 67R, so psalters and manuscripts and codices were they were different in that when we say, you know, the left page, which is, you know, 37, they likened it to verso and recto, verso meaning left and recto meaning right, and folio meaning page. So it was basically page 67 and was the right side of the page. So if you see R or V next to a number, you can assume that it is verso or recto, and folio just means page. But here is a different psalter. This is the Paris Psalter, and we have an image of David and Melodia. And this is really, really interesting to me because I put it up next to a mosaic of Orpheus. And right here, even though you can tell them apart, they very much have the same composition, which is just amazing to me. So these were several hundred years apart as well. But you can see how accompanying David helps him, or Melodia accompanying David helps him compose psalms. So Melodia is a personification of melody, which was probably based off of Orpheus himself. Orpheus being the god of music. And it makes sense. And there were a lot of personifications throughout a lot of these manuscripts, which is interesting. Both David and Orpheus can be seen soothing even the most savage of beasts. So you hear, you know, music soothe the savage beast, savage soul. That's probably where it comes from. And it has both Greco-Roman, Greek, and biblical origins. So you can notice the tree with the snake behind Orpheus and the tree behind Melodia. I mean, even how David and Orpheus are playing their instruments is extremely similar. The animals in the lower right-hand corner is extremely similar. So artists all throughout time would copy compositions. They would copy figures and body movements. So when you think something's original in art, it's probably not. And this is another favorite of mine. It's the Vienna Genesis around the early 6th century. And pictured here is Rebecca and Eleazar at the well. So this is an example of continuous narration, which provides multiple scenes in rapid succession. This was a very typical use or style within medieval times. You would have several images on one page, and they would all kind of like flow together to give you a sense that all these things occurred within succession. And it was created with purple vellum. The vellum was dyed purple, and the text was written in gold and silver ink. And the illuminations were probably done in tempera. But a walled city illustrates Eleazar's arrival. And then Rebecca walking towards the river. You see her twice, which is interesting, which is proof of this continuous narration. And she's walking towards the river, and you see in the corner, the left-hand corner, you see a reclined partial nude. And this nude personifies a river. And Rebecca meets Eleazar, who offers his camels water. And so my best guess is that instead of painting out the entire river, they created a personification of the river with her jug bearing into the river. So this was more Greco-Roman inspiration, but it's very interesting to me to see both a mythological and a religious tone being played on the same page. So there was a lot of melding, and you think that they wanted to stay as far away from each other as possible, but they mixed a lot, which I find very fascinating. But anyway, Rebecca's offering of water to Eleazar and his camels was a sign to him that Rebecca shall be Isaac's wife. Eleazar was a assistant of Abraham's, and Abraham had a son, Isaac, and he sent Eleazar to find him a wife, in which case he found Rebecca. But here we have a close-up, and this gets more into how you see personifications and Greek mythology right up against Christianity and other religions. So up at the top, we have a personification of river from the, the bottom is the personification of a river from Vienna Genesis. Below Euphrates, which is the guy on top, is the river god of Syria, which is now modern Turkey, from Greco-Roman Mosaic and Zeugma, which comes from the 1st to 2nd century. So this already predated Byzantine for like 100 years. And it just reiterates the use of classical art within a newly founded Christian art. But some notes to mention is that manuscripts, codices, and other texts were typically written, illustrated, and copied by monks for wealthy elite. So your common average person probably did not have a manuscript. They were extremely expensive to make. They took a whole lot of time to create and copy, and move around. But they were also given to priests who often carried them around to spread the word of God. And not all of them, but a fair amount were fairly compact, which aided in traveling. So it's just interesting to note that you can see similarities between cultures and religion at this time. And one last one, we have Theodore Psalter from the 11th century. Real quick, I do want to point this out. On the upper left-hand picture, you see these weird like symbols, but that is actually an angel. That is a biblically accurate angel. You see 2 sets of wings, and it is probably chipped out after time, but there was a face within those wings. But that's from the Theodore Psalter, and I just wanted to add that because I thought it was cool. All right. And this is a list of cathedrals in and around Pittsburgh that have Byzantine art that you might want to check out. And yeah, and that's my presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much,
So
Maria. Yeah, we can open it up to questions if anybody has them, either in the audience there or online. If you're online, please unmute yourself and you can ask them or put them in the chat.
I think we have a live member.
About 30 years ago, there was a huge show of Byzantine art at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, which I went to. One thing that I remember thinking about at the time was that very much as opposed to Western Christian art, there seemed to be a real dearth of images of crucified Christ.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Christ on the cross. And I'm wondering if I'm correct in that, because it's, of course, very humongous number of paintings in the West of Christ on the cross, but there seemed to not be that, at least in the show that was at the Metropolitan. So I'm wondering if there's a reason for that, or
there probably is. One thing I've learned is that nothing is done by happenstance. Everything is probably intended to be the way it is. I haven't seen a lot of Byzantine art where Christ is being depicted on the cross or being crucified, but that certainly doesn't mean that they aren't out there. It could have been a certain time period. It could have been later Byzantine, because I haven't really gone into later Byzantine. It could be some areas or sects of Christianity that really wanted to create these paintings. So, but I'll have to look more into that. Yes, you over there.
So, sorry. You said at the beginning that for the most part, before Constantine had made Christianity the national religion, that it was mostly a cult.
Mm-hmm.
So, looking at things, do you think, he was probably one of the first people who had power and money to make very large architecture and art about Christianity, so he was probably one of the first people. He was in a very unique position to do that kind of thing. So do you think a lot of his motivation about what the art was supposed to look like and the architecture was supposed to look like came from what he thought was God inspiring him, or was it a lot coming from pagan culture and Jewish and Muslim culture as well?
I'd say a lot of it was pagan culture, because a lot of artists were only depicting things the way they knew how to depict them. I'm sure Constantine had a lot of influence on how he wanted himself presented, and just cultural things like the inclusion of gold everywhere, and blue being the sky and the heavens, things that just kind of made sense. But as far as saying oh, I want that to look like that, that probably didn't occur as much. But he definitely influenced it to the point where all this was created. So monks did a lot of it, artists did a lot of it, but also at this time, artists never signed their work. You would have absolutely no idea who did some of these frescoes, who did some of these mosaics. It was seen as a craft, much like a baker or a metalsmith. It wasn't seen as something you'd want to sign Picasso. Yeah, it was inspired by him, but not a lot of evidence, you could say, he wanted saints to look a certain way. So that's a good question. I am going to exit out of this so I can see on my screen if anyone posted questions. So here, looks like you do have.
I haven't seen anything in the chat, but I did have a question myself.
One in the chat. Just so there aren't any other questions. Oh, okay.
There's a lot of talk about mosaics and fresco, because that was a type of art at the time. For other types of art, such related to Byzantine.
No, there were plenty of other types of art. I mean, frescoes and probably most common, especially in architecture. But you do have sculpture, you have marble, you have sandstone and things like that. But I would say the art wasn't so much inspired. The type of art wasn't necessarily Byzantine. Because you could see Byzantine art with mosaics and also frescoes or even manuscript art. So that was probably what was around the longest. And those things had a huge Greek and Roman influence. So frescoes, Greek, Roman, mosaics, Greek, Roman, sculptures, marble, Greek, Roman. There were others, but those were probably primarily the biggest. There were also woodblock carvings and stuff like that, stuff made out of stucco. Yeah. Oh. Was it common to see depictions of angels at this time? It was. I didn't really show too many in my video, besides that biblically accurate one. There are I would say saints were probably depicted a little more. But actually, I redact that because I think that they were depicted quite often. I'm pretty sure the image of Mary and child that was part of that icon I showed earlier, where that man was painting it. There was an angel beside him showing how to paint. So angels were very much portrayed, even in the cathedrals and everything, unless there was a story, like a biblical story with angels being involved. I would say most depictions of angels were ornamental. They weren't so much for stories, so people might not see them so much when you see a churches depicting stories like this and the Psalms and things like that. But they were there. If you look online for them, you should be able to find some. Yeah, let me know if anyone has any more questions.
Well, just a kind of a quick comment.
Yeah, absolutely.
In the West, there was also a classical thing about Reformation. Luther and Calvin did away with learns for saints.
Yeah.
Many Protestants that went through churches in Spanish statues, like watch the wall.
Yeah.
And other all images of Christ. So it wasn't only in the East.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because as far as religion or sects or even apart from one another, only very, very minute things separate them from each other, which I think is interesting. I forget which sect of Christianity it is, but there's two different sects because there was a dispute over one word, which was God through the Father or God by the Father and stuff like that. So through by created an entirely new sect, which is interesting. But yeah, it wasn't just in the West. I thought them happened before in other places, so it's interesting. I think that's it. Thank you, everyone. And thank you all online for attending.
Yes,
And
thank you very much.
Have your evening.
I'm going to wrap up the Zoom session now. Thank you again, Maria.